Today, as you might have seen from the holding side, we are starting with an introduction to localization and risk-informed development. So it's a short 1 hour webinar. We'll have first some introductory remarks from our executive director, Vijay Kumar. Then we'll go into looking a bit as some of the key features of localization as an approach for resilience building and risk-informed development. And we'll be learning more about a toolkit to integrate risk consideration into development activities. The toolkit is something that's currently being developed by GNDR with the support of our consultant Loli Ameri, who will present the toolkit during this webinar. So as I said, hopefully we'll take about half an hour to share what we have to share on localization, risk-informed development, and hopefully there will be half an hour for questions and answers and discussions, any input from the participants. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to GNDR's Executive Director, Vijay Kumar. Vijay has a long track record in humanitarian and development work, and particularly in disaster risk reduction. His expertise is in leading and managing civil society organizations and networks, and he's gained his expertise through hands-on experience working across various countries in various continents, spanning from Africa, Europe, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. He's a strong advocate of shifting power from international system to community-led capacities, facilitated by local organizations. And he's also a passionate promoter of human rights and people power, both in policy advocacy and in implementation. Needless to say, for a lot of GNDR members, this is very, very known, but Vijay has also been leading the development of GNDR's new strategy that started in 2020, that follow a highly consultative process that involved many of our members across countries through in-person and online consultations. Vijay, please, you have the floor.
Thanks, Valeria. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, salam alaikum, namaste, pranam, jumbo. And warm greetings to all the participants who have kindly agreed to participate in this process. As Valeria introduced myself, I work as the executive director of this network. It is a privilege for me to serve a network of 1,640 organizations from across 128 countries. We are committed for a collective pursuance to primarily work for building the resilience of the communities most at risk. This resilience that we are talking of primarily is impacted by the various forms of disaster that we have seen, which are interconnected, which are systemic, and this resilience is currently challenged. And this resilience of the people that we are talking of are the people most at risk, who have been disproportionately impacted by the various hazards and disproportionately exposed to the various forms of marginalization and oppression, which has made it impossible for them to come out of their trap, their poverty, risk, and marginalization process and that trap to primarily build the resilience. And we are committed to work together to achieve that. In that context, what we are actually saying that can only be achieved if we start listening to the voice of those very people who are experiencing, who are having this lived-in experience of the disasters, of the risk. And how that can happen? That can only happen if we facilitate a process that primarily allow and enable the communities most at risk to identify their risk around them, analyze that, prioritize that, and integrate that into a local level planning process, where the local planning process take on board the way things can be done, resources can be allocated, and decision can be actually taken to ensure that the communities most at risk are engaged in strengthening their resilience. Now, who does this work? We know it, you know it, I know it, and all of us who know it, we know that this particular facilitation is done by the civil society organizations who are most prominent in the role, and they are best placed to deliver it. So what we are trying to actually see, how this network of civil society organizations, the NGOs, the small, big, local NGOs, national NGOs, INGOs come together, facilitate that process to strengthen that ability of the community to analyze, prioritize, and respond to the resilience building process, and at the same time influence the policies and practices at local level, national level, and global level. That is primarily the foundation of localization process that we are talking of, where we are trying to ensure the ability, the linkages, the capacity, the knowledge is built at that level, at the local level, at the community level, at the where the community can use it and access those resources that they need. And that is best done by this network of civil society organizations, as I said. I see local leadership academy is a move towards achieving this. We are initiating this process. It is a first step, and we are in the process of learning as to how to do it. We will be benefited by your input, recommendations, and participation to take it forward together, which will promote the facilitation process. But for doing that facilitation as civil society organizations from across the globe, we actually share, learn from each other, strengthen our own capacities to facilitate that process. That is what is at the root of what we are trying to do. My best wishes are there with this process, and we are committed to express our solidarity, partnership with all of you to pursue this agenda that we are actually talking of. The agenda of change, agenda of transformation, agenda of building the resilience of the communities most at risk, so that we can live in a world which is primarily have that capacity to withstand the impact of hazards in various forms that we are currently experiencing. Thank you very much, and all the best.
Thank you, Vijay. Thank you so much for opening the Academy. I will move forward to giving a bit of an overview of localization and its key features as we see it at GNDR. So let me just share my screen again. Okay, I hope you can see it. If not, please shout. So yes, as I was saying, this is just a brief introduction to the topic of localization and how it connects to risk-informed development from GNDR's perspective. We see the two as two aspects of strengthening community resilience. So on one hand, localization supports risk-informed development by enhancing local engagement and leadership in decision-making. And then on the other hand, risk-informed development supports localization as it puts a strong emphasis on local risk perception and the views of communities most at risk. So what do we mean by localization? We mean that local civil society and communities at risk are able to participate, to influence and take decisions on risk-informed development policies and practices. We see it as having several dimensions. Of course, there is, the essential aspect of transferring financial resources to the local level in a higher amount than is currently done. But it's also a matter of strengthening the capacities of local community to be able to engage and meaningfully participate in decision-making processes. It's about creating effective governance and accountability mechanisms so that their participation is effectively considered and it is not a tokenistic exercise. It's about creating an enabling policy environment, especially at the national level, that supports the delegation of responsibilities, of decision-making power to local actors. And it's about creating linkages horizontally among different sectors and among different aspects of development, resilience, etc. But it's also about creating linkages vertically between local, subnational, national, and international levels and actors. It's not what localization is not. It's not about doing local work in isolation. We all know and are aware well that we live in a global village, one could say, where our lives are interlinked and our localities are connected. So one of the focuses of our work for localization is to connect local leaders with each other, to share knowledge and experience so that together they can advocate for change for themselves. We're very much aware of some risks being global and having to take a bit of a local approach to resilience building at community level. The other aspect that is key for GNDR is that everyone plays a role in localization. So civil society organizations at the local and national level facilitate community leadership, but you have a role for civil society organizations at the international level and INGO in supporting national and local NGOs in their work and sharing decision-making power and responsibilities with them. So it's about working together. There's a huge focus on collaboration and partnerships to make sure that localization does happen, and it's streamlined, I would say, and scaled up across different sectors in different countries. So at the national level, as I was mentioning before, we need to create this enabling environment. So what are the conditions that allow local level actors to take on more responsibilities and effectively participate in decision making? We're isolated cases of good practices are good, but they're not enough. They need to be plugged into national level policies to scale them up. And to do this, we engage governments, we bring evidence up, and we involve local actors in doing so. We are currently working on research to understand what are the key elements of localization from a national level perspective. What are some of the national level policies that create this enabling environment for localization? And we are looking at 6 different aspects that help creating this enabling environment, and of course, particular elements under all these different aspects. So just to give a few initial thoughts, and it would be great to then read your comments or your experiences about localization and working with national governments and localization in the chat box, or do add it as a question in the Q&A box. With regards to policy and regulation, we see that a lot of this enabling environment is created. It's created by having political leadership, a vision, strategic intent that supports localization. Legislations and policies, of course, at the national level are a key practical tool for localization to happen. And transparency and accountability arrangement as well are essential. And similarly, on finance and resources, local government budget allocations are a key aspect. Access to flexible finance mechanisms for local actors, as well as mobilization of local resources, play an important role. We look at knowledge and culture in the sense of having awareness and understanding of risk among local actors and communities at risk is, of course, an important element to make sure that participation is effective and has meaning in resilience building. Having a culture of collaboration and solidarity is a key aspect. Having people who are motivated and engaged, and they know that they can make a difference, they know that they have a role to play, is another important element. And similarly, on the organizational bit, coordination mechanisms, as we were saying before, vertical and horizontal and vertical alignment are essential to strengthening coherence, but also to make sure that there is that passing on of information from the local level to the subnational and the national level. Competent local leadership, participatory planning tools and processes are also essential. And as mentioned before, collaborations and partnership, it's a key element for localization. The presence of network coalitions, alliances within a country is a clear indicator of how much of that interaction, of that coordination across levels and across sectors is happening, but also how easy it is to, or what the culture is in the sense of setting up equitable and complementary partnerships between local governments, between civil society organizations, communities at risk, the private sector, and other actors in the country. And then, of course, there is an element of how much these collaborations and partnerships reach the most marginalized, reach the remote communities, the people who are most at risk and often left behind. As you probably know, if you're familiar with GNDR and with the network, our focus is a lot on communities and communities at risk. It's placing them at the center of decision-making processes so that they're able to participate and influence resilience processes. We see this placing communities at the center as an approach to, let's say, shift power to share power. So we see localization a bit as a political tool to bring at-risk communities at the same level as power holders and sharing that responsibility and decision-making power that currently communities don't have. Community involvement, of course, is key for resilience. As we all know, communities have knowledge, they have experience of the threats they face and their consequences, and they often know what actions might be helpful to reduce risks and the barriers to those actions. And this knowledge and this experience need to be taken into account for effective risk-informed development. And that's where we see the connection between localization and risk-informed development as both reinforcing each other. What do we mean when we say risk-informed development? I think this is a term that is commonly used, but I think it's often good to just make sure that we are on the same place in the sense of what it means. And we mean undertaking risk assessments and acting upon that knowledge. And when we talk about risk assessments, undertaking these risk assessments, the analysis needs to be done from the perspective of communities most at risk, who are, of course, the ones who often are disproportionately affected by disasters, but also the ones that are the first to respond. They are the ones, as we were saying before, that have the knowledge and the experience, and their perspective need to be the one that we look at risk from. So what are the risks that matter to them? What are the main threats that they face? And what are some of the solutions that can be put in place? I will just briefly mention our 6 risk drivers. So I was saying in the beginning, the Local Leadership Academy will focus on each of these risk drivers in the upcoming webinars. And these are 6 aspects that members have identified as increasing disaster risk for communities. They all come into play when doing risk-informed development, because these are often contexts that people find themselves in when trying to advance resilience and advance development. They have an impact, of course, on resilience building efforts at the local level, but often at the national and international level as well. So we believe the local leadership, local knowledge can help further understanding of how to deal with these challenges. And that's why we are working very intensively in trying to understand more what the 6 risk drivers mean and what localization and risk-informed development mean in this context. So how can we achieve them? How can we do them? Both localization and risk-informed development are strategic goals for GNDR, so we're placing a huge importance of them. And our 6 risk drivers are also guiding our work for the next 4 years. I will stop here in the sense of this short introduction to localization, and I will invite Lolia to share a bit more about risk-informed development. Of course, knowing, as mentioned at the beginning, localization and risk-informed development are two aspects of strengthening community resilience. So they go hand in hand together. So that's why we are putting quite a lot of emphasis in it and developing the risk-informed development planning guide. And Lolia will give a bit of an overview of what this guide is about. Let me introduce you, Lolia. Lolia Mary is an environmental planner and architect with experience in the field of spatial development planning across different scales and landscapes. She holds a master's degree in environmental planning from the School of Planning and Architecture from New Delhi. And she's worked with various international organizations, as well as national and local ones. Some of them include UNDP, the Government of India, the World Resource Institute, GIZ, the World Bank, and others. She's working with GNDR, as I was mentioning, in developing this risk-informed development planning guide, and we'll have a bit of an overview of it right now. Lolia, please. I hope you can share your screen. Let me know if you're not able to.
Thank you, Valeria, for the introduction. And I will share my screen right now. I hope it is visible.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, let me put it on.
Perfect.
Yeah, so thank you, Valeria, for introducing and giving an overview of what risk-informed development is and the relevance of that in this context that we are living in. So I will be introducing the guideline for risk-informed development planning. So we developed these guidelines to enable most at-risk communities and CSOs working with these communities to better understand risk and to take actions and development decisions around these risks that can help not only mitigate, but also prepare them through resilient development and sustainable development planning. And therefore, we advocate a community-led, participatory, and inclusive planning process. So when we think about development, it is basically activities to improve our living conditions as over these years. And over time, this has translated into building houses, to all the way to building even dams and mega structures. And what this has done over the course of time is that it has translated into drivers of risk themselves. So risk-informed development planning is about understanding these externalities related to risk, disasters, or the risk drivers that were earlier mentioned by Valeria, and also how our current development practices are not sustainable and how these can actually be a causative factor for risk and affecting people, their assets, and habitats they live in. So therefore, risk-informed development planning is about knowledge generation around risks and to be risk-informed, to understanding risks in the context and in the conditions, especially local conditions that communities exist in, which is very unique to different localities, to different landscapes, to different cultural conditions. It is also about following up with actions on the knowledge that we have gained around risk, so as to undertake development that is resilient and sustainable. So we developed and we designed these, the process of risk-informed development planning, and the guidelines are designed around 3 sets of principles. The first set of principle is about how CSOs and communities can engage in the risk-informed development planning process. So it has to be participatory and collaborative in the sense that it has to include all members of the community, as well as all stakeholders who have a role to play in influencing decisions around development for any community at any scale, such that it is empowering to the communities to take their own decisions, especially informed decisions around risks and how they affect it. The second set of principles are about essentially understanding the risks themselves in the planning process, which is to say that risk information has to be localized and contextual, which is to say that communities should be able to understand the specific risks and risk responses that they have, the implications to the risks, and also the relation of those risks to larger scales of risk drivers at national, global, or regional scales. Risk-informed development planning should also be aspirational and anticipatory. This is to say that it has to take into consideration future trends of development, or it has to enable communities to imagine how their aspirations of development align with future risks and how those risks would affect their aspirations. And eventually it has to be action oriented in response to the deeper understanding of risk at local scales and risks that are anticipated for the community. The third set of principles that we focused on while developing the guidelines for risk-informed development planning is around the process itself, the process of development planning, which is to say that the planning process itself has to be iterative, it has to be in a phased manner. This is because we all know risks that evolve globally and affect communities locally are ever evolving and dynamic. So is development. Therefore, our process of understanding of risk and risk-informed development planning decisions themselves have to be iterative and updated and improved upon. So that is why it cannot be a linear start to end process. It has to be a cyclic process which is capable to be updated. And through all of these processes, only when communities are involved in actively managing the actions that they have taken can there be a sense of ownership and custodianship, which is very essential in owning the risk-informed development planning process. So those are the principles which has helped us evolve a development planning process that is risk-informed. So now I would like to quickly give an overview of the framework that we evolved for risk-informed development planning. So we have tried to phase the planning process into 3 phases. The first phase is about defining or redefining and essentially understanding context and risks related to that. So the 3 stages in this phase of risk-informed development planning is first, CSOs organizing between themselves and with the communities to collaborate for a risk-informed development planning process. The second stage is about engaging with communities to carry out an exercise, a visioning exercise, where all the aspirations of all the different members of the community is brought to the discussion table, and there is a mutual understanding of where communities and individuals want to evolve into the future in terms of development. The third aspect or the third stage at this phase would be about gathering information that is already existing and also generating local information which is available in the place that you live in. So this is about collaborating with communities to gather information and to generate local information, which is very critical in understanding contextual issues, which is very directly involved with the communities that we are engaging with. The second phase is about getting into a deeper understanding of risk, which is to essentially assess and anticipate these risks. And this stage also involves enabling communities and CSOs facilitating communities to foresee the future through various scenarios that they imagine, and to understand how the current risks translate into future, as well as identifying emerging future risks, which may not be easily understandable by looking at current issues. And then again, obviously, to strategize, to take actions specifically to deal with these risks, both of the current both in the current context and also with respect to future imagined scenarios. And the next phase is obviously to act on and implement these actions that have been strategized specifically to deal with these issues. And when we say implementation, it can be through various modes, and to ensure that these actions and decisions are acted upon, these has to be monitored, evaluated, and managed by the community members itself. So the guidelines are designed around these aspects of risk-informed development planning. The guidelines also specifically suggest ways and methods and tools to carry out each of these stages. And if you look at the dotted line which cuts across all of these stages, that is the role CSOs play in facilitating the entire process, which is to say that their involvement is not limited to carrying out individual stages, but it is about connecting between these stages while engaging with communities at risk. So that is the framework within which we have evolved the guidelines. So the guidelines are detailed into various stages, and each of those stages are provided with key aspects and key steps to take, along with tools and additional references which can enable CSOs in carrying out such a process on ground. That is a brief introduction on the guidelines we have developed. Over to you, Valeria.
Thank you, Lolia. Thank you so much. It's great to see this taking shape, and I think a lot of people will find it very useful when the guidelines is ready. So we'll be sharing the slides at the end of the webinar together with the recording. And if you're interested, of course, keep an eye out for more information on the Risk-Informed Development Planning Guide. So we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A box. Please feel free to add your questions in. Great. So we can, I'm just reading some of them through. I wonder if I can call on BJ just to have a couple, to elaborate a little bit more on how localization and shifting in power are, how they're connected, where they meet, or what the difference might be sometimes. If you are still online, BJ, that would be great to have your perspective on that. I know you have a lot to say on the topic, and you are passionate of shifting power to share power with local organizations. So if you're online, please feel free to unmute yourself and come in. I'm not sure if BJ is online. I think perhaps maybe he's not. So I will move to a couple of other questions. There's quite a few in the Q&A box. So there is one, I think I can take it's fairly brief, from Johan from Haiti. You're saying, what do you think if we propose to the governments of most vulnerable countries to introduce training on resilience building in their school programs? I mean, I think that is, I would say that is a great initiative. I believe some countries have similar curricula already. There's also a global alliance on education for disaster risk reduction that is working quite closely with UN agencies and governments in trying to make this happen. One of the aspects of localization for its enabling environment is the knowledge and the culture, especially the culture that exists within a country. This culture of collaboration and solidarity, understanding the risk that people face, and being aware that actions can be taken at the local level and that people can come together to address some of these risks. So I think that is definitely a great initiative. If you are working with some other GNDR members in the country, or if you'd like to connect with the Global Alliance for Education and Disaster Risk Reduction, do let us know. I'd be happy to put you in touch. I don't know if they have done work in Haiti, but they would probably be very interested to explore. There is a question, I think there are a couple of questions that I'll direct to you, Lolia, if that's okay. So one, Alik is asking, what can we do to reduce the risks on or the impact of disaster that happens in communities? And I think this development guide, will help doing exactly that. And maybe you can elaborate a bit more in the sense of the purpose a bit of the guide, but I can also talk on that. And Ella is asking if you could elaborate on the difference between community custodianship and community managed in the guiding principles of the development or the planning guide.
Okay. So I think I will take the first question, which is about what can we do to reduce the risk on impact and impacts of risk, I suppose, that happens in the community. So risks can be reduced or the impacts can be managed only when we can anticipate them in ahead, and then also take actions ahead to prevent the possibilities of these risks. So, which is why it is important that we have an informed understanding and also scientific understanding of what the future risks are, and also to put in place measures and mechanisms where communities can easily or the communities have enough capacity to easily respond to these risks. So when I say preparing for risks, it's about knowing these risks and also taking actions, and these actions ahead are around mitigative strategies, which may be around strengthening the ecosystem services, landscape infrastructure that are there, or ensuring that development regulations in terms of identifying areas that are, in the sense spatially, identifying areas that are most vulnerable or most at risk, and ensuring that those areas are not allowed to expand or urbanize and things like that, such that it will put people who are going to reside in those places at risk. So it can be dealt with in different ways and strategies, and all of that can only be initiated unless only when we are able to imagine and anticipate future risks and pinpoint where they occur and when they could occur. And I guess the development planning toolkit is essentially oriented to help people understand these aspects of risk-informed development planning.
Thank you, Lolia. Just a couple of questions related to languages and the risk-informed development planning guide. So yes, this presentation is in English. The planning guide will be also in French and Spanish, so you will be able to access it in your own language. And it will be available on the website, on GNDR's website, and we'll be sharing it with you as well. So that will be available in other languages other than English. I'm looking at a couple of other questions. Solomon is interested in learning a bit more about the research on localization. So I can briefly respond to that, and then perhaps I think there's a couple of other ones in the Q&A box that look at the importance of increasing national budget for disaster reduction program, which is of course a very tough one. Getting planning agencies to actually consider future risks in development planning. So how can we get them to see the importance of risk-informed development? So perhaps, Lolia, you can have a look at some of these questions in the Q&A box, and I'll give the floor to you as well shortly. But yes, so on the localization research, what we're hoping to have is some information on what national level policies, mechanisms, structures are facilitating localization to happen. So, for example, a lot of the governments use decentralization as a policy tool for localization, because that helps in localizing decision-making, responsibilities and budgets to local authorities, and hence working more closely with local actors. So we're hoping to have a better sense of what is this enabling environment at the national level that can support localization. I think we're very conscious that national governments play an important role in making localization happen, and especially in engaging and involving local actors in decision making. So we're still in the process of doing research, talking with different people, understanding the context a bit more. But we hope to be able to share within a few months some of the outcomes of this research. I'm particularly looking forward to it, because it will also help us understand. It will also help us have a sense of whether a country is on the way to localization or not, in the sense of whether their national policies are supportive of localization or not. And I think that will be extremely helpful knowledge in knowing what to push for in national level advocacy, but from a GNDR perspective, also at international level, how can we support localization happening at the within national governments at the national level. So yeah, I would say stay tuned for that as well. Hopefully will come in the next few months. Lolia, did you want to come in for a couple of the other questions that are in the chat box?
Yes, so I think I didn't respond to the earlier question on the difference between community custodianship and community management. So when we say community management in the context of risk-informed development, it is about enabling communities to manage the actions that are taken at local level to mitigate risk. So that is about actively playing a role, in the sense communities actively playing a role in managing these actions that they have decided on to mitigate risk. Whereas custodianship is about creating a mindset among community members about owning the process of risk-informed development planning, so that they have a sense of ownership in carrying out the various processes and playing a vital role in decisions around it. So management would be more around making active participation, whereas custodianship is more about evolving a mindset among community members in owning the process itself. I think I tried to clarify that. If not, I guess when we go through the guidelines, it'll be clearer. And I think there was a question on difficulty.
Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the difficulty of getting planning agencies to consider all future risks. So that is a well accepted and understood difficulty, especially because development planning agencies conventionally practice a planning process which is a little bit outdated, and therefore the process itself is stretched out across long spans of time, and it seldom aligns with cross-sectoral alignment, aligns with cross-sectoral understanding of risk and things like that. So I think the role the CSOs can play in pushing development planning agencies to recognize these risks is to carry out community-led risk assessments and risk-informed development planning suggestions and analysis and bring them towards decision makers who can then take, who are then obliged to take action in the right direction.
Thank you, Lolia. There's a lot of other questions coming in, so keep sharing your questions in the Q&A box. If we're not able to address all of them, we'll hopefully respond to them by in writing, and we can share them with you. I'm looking if there's maybe another short one that we can respond to before we close. Unfortunately, we have 1 hour together. It's really just a snapshot of the planning guide and of localization. I think some of these are also common. So, for example, Kalik is saying risk can be managed by proper risk analysis and preparedness and risk reduction action in place. Capacity building of vulnerable people also reduce the risk. And I absolutely agree. I think that's why we're trying to put, to talk of localization as also increasing capacities of communities so that they can lead their own resilience building efforts, and of course looking at risk from the perspective of these communities is then another essential point to understand what needs to be done and how to make resilience building efforts more effective. There's a question from Ibrahim, perhaps Lolia, in your experience you might have some thoughts on it, how to finance resilience and risk reduction projects. We know the usual channels. Often disaster risk reduction funding comes from, humanitarian funds, but there is an element of resilience, which is, there's a strong element that is development. So I wonder if, Lolia, you have thoughts in the sense of how can some of these projects be financed, or what have you seen in your previous experiences around, financing resilience projects?
So that's kind of a difficult question to answer because, finding funds, if we are thinking about finding funds for carrying out an entire process together, it may be difficult, but then the trick is trying to break down the process into manageable actions and activities that CSOs can engage with communities, and to be able to find funds or sponsorship for carrying out these individual activities. But then again, it has to be anchored on the capacity of the communities themselves in carrying out these exercises. So, but then when we are talking about implementing certain tangible actions or development actions or building a protective system to prevent certain disasters, then the funding definitely has to come in, and that would certainly require more funds. And finding funds would obviously span across not just government schemes and policies that may fit into the requirements of the action, but also through other CSR funds or financing through collective efforts or crowdsourcing and things like that. But then again, it is about identifying specific actions which need external funding and trying to find funds within the community itself in mobilizing that kind of funds for smaller actions.
Thank you. Yeah, it is a tricky question. Sorry to have put you on the spot. Right. I think there's quite a lot, quite a few other questions on the chat box, varying and differing ones in terms of questions being asked. There's only a few minutes left, unfortunately, so perhaps I'll have to stop the questions here and just making sure that we have, making sure that we have the questions, so we have everything saved in our Zoom account, of course, and we'll be able to respond to all of them in writing. Hopefully we can send something when the slides go out and the recording goes out as well. But I just wanted to say that hopefully this has been an interesting taster of what is to come. Being the first of the Local Leadership Academy webinars, we thought this could act more as an introduction to the topic. From next month, so from the 21st of October, we'll go into specific on each of the 6 risk drivers that I mentioned before. So we'll be looking at climate change, we'll be looking at conflict, forced displacement, food, water insecurity, gender inequality and urbanization, one for each month. And we're looking at how do we increase local leadership and local capacities to meaningfully participate in resilience activities in decision making in the context of the 6 different risk drivers. So as I was saying, the next one is in risk-informed development in a climate change context. We look at adaptation as an approach to risk-informed development. We hope that with the webinar, participants will strengthen their capacities on understanding climate change adaptation measures, taking into account the needs of communities most at risk. And we'll also learn more about adaptation and loss and damage, as well as mitigation measures under the UNFCCC conventions, the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change. So there will be a bit of the policy environment at international level that guides climate action. So this webinar will be on the 21st of October between 2 and 3 p.m. UK time. I believe my colleagues have shared the link in the chat box to register for the next webinars. Again, it will be held in English with French and Spanish interpretation. And then in November, stay tuned for a webinar that will look at local leadership and risk-informed development in conflict and fragile areas settings. In December, we'll look a bit more closely at forced displacement. And then in the new year, we'll have the remaining 3 risk drivers. Last but not least, as I mentioned, you will receive recordings, you will receive the slides, and at the end of the webinar, you will also be asked to fill a short evaluation form. This is helpful for us to understand how this has gone, whether it was interesting, useful for people, and what can be improved going forward. So I really hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you for being interested in this webinar, for the huge participation in the Q&A box, in the chat box. I see lots of messages going in both of these tools. So it's great to have so much engagement. And do keep an eye on GNDR's channel, whether if you receive the newsletter or if you are on GNDR's community platform for the Risk-Informed Development Planning Guide when it will be launched, and also for more information about the localization research that we're undertaking. If you want to follow up from this webinar, feel free to reach out to us. I will leave my email address in the chat box if anyone's interested or wants to share any of their experiences, any thoughts or questions. Don't hesitate to email myself or any of my colleagues. There is my email in the chat box. We always look forward to hearing from you. So this is all. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for participating. And thank you, Lolia, for your presentation and all your work that you're doing with GNDR. And I think a big thanks to our interpreters who have helped us today. I think your work is very much appreciated. I can see lots of appreciation comments in the chat box. And we'll see you all next month, 21st of October. Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Thank you for all the important questions.